Welcome back, everybody. It's good to be back into this place where we are discussing one of my favorite topics on sociology. And today we're going to be discussing we're going to go a little further in our topic of sociology. And today we're going to discuss a topic that I wrote as one of my final papers when I was in class. And this topic is entitled Being Born to Perform. One of my favorite theorists in sociology is Ervin Goffman. And a lot of his theory has influenced my thinking around sociology. And so from that perspective, I wrote this paper in school, and I wanted to share this topic because I felt that it was a topic that was very relevant to what's going on in our society today, as well as a topic that can help us understand ourselves and why a lot of things are happening in our society the way that they are happening. And so what we're going to talk about today is a topic called Born to Perform. Now, one of the things that we have to understand when we say that someone is born to perform is we have to look at certain perspectives and topics in sociology that might relate to that, such as the self, society, social influences, socialization, the social construction of the self. There's a lot of concepts that we can look at in sociology that can help us make this topic relevant to our lives today. And we know that the self is the way that individuals present themselves to others in a socially constructed way. And so this self is at all times being modified to fit into society. Some people will say, well, what is the self? The self is who you present to others. It's what you present to others. It's how you perform in front of others. It's what you think others expect you to do in their presence, in social settings, at work, at home. It's always the pressure on you to perform. And so you have to find ways to construct a self that is acceptable. And so once that self is constructed, there are certain dynamics that make it acceptable. This is where performance comes into play, where you are born to perform. The self individuals have become is born and socially constructed to perform. In the end, they can look at that self as a fluid self and perform based on the impression it wants to make. So no impression that you make is a permanent, lasting impression. You're always building an impression of yourself. You're always trying to perform to make it okay for you to feel accepted and feel okay about yourself. So the self, there are 3 self-representations. And each of these self-representations, there are at least 3 belief domains in which the self is represented. They are the private self, what is believed about what makes a person unique, that's the private self. The relational self, what is shared with a partner, and the collective self, what is shared with the many groups people belong to. And so with all of this, we look at ourselves and we wonder, how did I become the person that I am today? Why do I act the way I act? Why do I think the way I think? Why do I perform the way I perform at work, at home, in social settings? Because you have been constructed socially based on what you believe based on the sanctions that you receive of the self that you present to in those 3 domains: the private self, the relational self, and the collective self. All of this personality building helps you become the person that you are. In sociology, we call it socialization, which means that there are agencies that help assist you in becoming the self that you are today. And so it's important that you understand that we're not always going to be who others want us to be, but our entire life is about us constructing that person that we believe others want us to be. So whether we understand clearly what is expected of us when we perform in society, that's irrelevant. What's relevant is how you read the situation. And so if you don't understand the situation that you're in, then it's very hard for you to know how to act in that situation. So each day you look at yourself, whether you look in the mirror or you just look into your mind or you look into your environment, and you say, well, how am I supposed to perform today? Now, these are not in the front of the consciousness, but they're in the subconscious, which is where you perform and you tell yourself, okay, this activity that I'm about to do, is this acceptable? Society supports your choices by either sanctioning those choices with positive sanctions or negative sanctions. People around you decide whether or not the self you present to them is going to be an acceptable self. And so you know whether or not you are acceptable based on how well you are able to integrate into the setting that you're in. If you are being rejected, then maybe you should look at the situation that you're in and say to yourself, well, what is this situation asking of me? What is this dynamic, this environment that I'm in? What impression are they asking me to make? Now, this does not mean that you are being fake or phony, or that you are not being the person that you believe that you really are. What you're saying is, what I'm going to project in this situation is based on how I'm understanding this situation to be. So in these domains, you have to look at yourself in private. What do you expect of yourself? How do you believe that you are expected to act? And so from this perspective, we see ourselves from the perspective of living on a stage. I believe that we are all born onto the stage of life. And because we're born onto the stage of life, socialization helps us understand what our part is. When we send our children at home, when we're born and we are being socialized at home to fit into the greater society, at home we learn right and wrong. We learn what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior. We learn what sanctions are, punishment, what reward systems are. We understand what makes people, which of our actions will make people happy and which of our actions will make people sad. We learn all of these things at home. We learn whether or not something is going to harm us. We learn how to basically control our fears, or we learn whether or not something we fear is something that we should continue to fear, or we learn to get over those fears. And so every day we're performing, and we're performing from 3 self-representations. And of those representations, we always try to find out which one of them best fit the situation. So if we're in a situation, we should try to understand, how are we expected to act in that situation? When we're around our family members and we go to family reunions, or we go on family trips, or we have private situations where we're with our siblings. What do our siblings think of us? Whether you believe it or not, these are always ideas and concepts that you are constantly going over unaware to find out which of these selves am I supposed to present in this situation. Do your family think that you're the jokester? Do they think that you're the one that brings all the fun all the time? Do they call you the black sheep, or, the troublemaker? These are things that we need to look at, because when we are faced with these types of stereotypes, then what happens is we automatically perform that particular act when we're in the presence of others. And so we have to learn how important it is to integrate into society and to make it so that we are not unaware of how we're acting. That's where the trouble comes in at. A lot of these performances that we do on the stage of life and in these environments, all of these performances we're doing them unaware. They're automatic because we've been socialized to act this way. Now, some would say, oh, well, what you're saying is we have no control over how we act. Do you? Do you actually have control over how you act? Or are you always trying to impress someone or be impressive in a situation or present a self that you have assumed is acceptable in the situation as you understand it? And so one of the things that we have to understand is that once we create, a self and perform the parts that we feel are acceptable, as we grow that self that we create, the parts that we grow and perform, they expand more and more. They become more and more a part of our concept of who we are and how we are integrating into society. So think of this, and this is maybe a little extreme, but I want you to think of this. You wonder why it is that in minority communities, there are so many negative stereotypes, and why these stereotypes are on the. Remember, I talked about the three self-representations. These stereotypes are integrated into the private self, in the relational self, and in the collective self. And so when you go into minority neighborhoods and you look at how people live, you automatically read the situation. You look at it and the first thing you think is, wow, I'm in a ghetto or I'm in a minority neighborhood. So what type of stereotypes have I been socialized to believe about these neighborhoods and areas that I'm in? First of all, we associate it with, a lot of times, Black people, what they call lower class white people, what they call the working class, or the what they call the immigrant class. Excuse me. And so we have already been socialized to have an understanding of what these types of people are, what they represent, how they act, and we go in with preconceived ideas. And so we expect people in these neighborhoods to act a certain way. But what's more profound is they expect that they're supposed to act a certain way. And so from generation to generation to generation, they socialize their children to continue to perpetuate activities. For instance, and this is a stereotype that all of us are familiar with. In the minority neighborhoods, we have a lot of our young Black teenage girls, not just Black teenage girls, but minorities in general. And we know that in society, we know that culturally and what is the word I want to use? And experimentally, I'll say, we know that all ethnic groups have issues with teenage pregnancies. But in the media, which is one of our socializing agents, we tend to find that there are more young Black women being presented in the media as pregnant, on welfare, constantly having babies. So we got young girls having 3, 4, 5 babies with different men. And some of them, even if they do have the same fathers, those fathers are not home because those fathers are either in jail, or those fathers have been socialized to believe that they are unnecessary in the lives of their children. And so we go into neighborhoods with stereotypical thinking, and we perpetuate that in our children. Our children grow up in the same exact neighborhoods that we grow up in. And you take them around, you say, yeah, this is the corner I used to sell drugs on. Or this is the corner where I met your dad, or I met your mom. And, this is where I got pregnant. And we don't even realize that we're socializing our children to perform a certain way. And so we perpetuate these performances. All of life is a stage. One of our theorists says, and Ervin Goffman talks about and says that a person performs a performance before a given audience and follows a pre-established pattern of action, which is called a part. So you're playing a part every day of your life, whether you believe it or not. You are acting out a part on the stage of life. In sociology, there are backstage actors and front stage actors. There are, you also have to look at your surroundings. You have to look at where is it you're acting at, and under what circumstances are you performing this particular self. And so, as we were stating earlier, it's hard to conceptualize a necessary self because everywhere you go, that self that you have created is fluid. You go home and there's a self that performs. You go to work, there's a self that performs. You go to school, there's a self that performs. You go to a party, you go to your friend's house, you go to your parents' house, you go home from school. And all of these situations, if you're not understanding what is being required of you in these situations, then you will begin to perform based on your socialization in those situations. And so we'll get into socialization even further as we continue throughout this topic. And so, so society has a tendency, in other words, the social personality is based on certain stereotypes within society. Now, we talked last time in our last video about society, and we made the statement that society is like, quote, like God. Not that society is God. Society is here before you get here, and society will be here when you are gone. And so that is kind of God-like. That is kind of like a spiritual kind of situation. You know, you're born into society. And so society has already set up stereotypes. Society has already set up agencies of socialization. Society has already set up the rules and regulations that you are expected to obey as you integrate into the larger society. You can look at your small little environment where you're born into. When you're born and the doctor turns you upside down and smacks you on your bottom, there's an expectation for you to make a sound, right? And also, when you are looking into the face of your beautiful children, your babies when they're born, you have an expectation of the baby smiling and accepting the face that you are giving them. And babies are very, very innocent. But one thing is for sure, they are much more sensitive to personalities and to the sensitivities of what it is that you are putting out, the energies that you're putting out. And so babies learn on smaller levels as babies, but then as they get older and they begin to conceptualize the situation, they begin to perform. You know, they begin to act out. What makes mommy and daddy smile? What do I need to do to gain acceptance? Or they grow up thinking, there's something I need to do to be fed. So they cry. When there's something I need to do to get my diaper changed, so they cry. So babies are born with these performance abilities. And so we don't want to get too deep into this because, as I stated, these are very light topics that we're going to be discussing when we talk about sociology and this topic of socialization. And so the other thing we need to understand is that groups are used to project an acceptable self. We perform in groups. We practice in groups. Whether those groups be one or two groups, we practice. We tend to associate the self within the group more so than the out groups. You know what in groups are? In groups are the groups that accept you. Such as you're a female, so you know that you're accepted in the female group. You're black, you might be more accepted in a black community than another community. Let's say you're rich, that's an in group for you. But if you're poor, you're considered in an out group, because in the in group, everybody's rich. We're getting back into stratification again, which we talked about last week, class. the different ways that society groups its individuals. And so being born is very important because it's an automatic membership into one of the biggest social clubs ever, called the human race. And that is very, very interesting. Ervin Goffman, which many of you that are listening to this are familiar with, Ervin Goffman, one of the social theorists, recast the theatrical term dramaturgy as a sociological term. He saw life as a stage, the human race as the performers on that stage. However, people are never hired or paid to perform. They are born to perform. It's the performance and how we present ourselves that writes the plays of life. And so, in other words, when Goffman just talked about dramaturgy, he was basically talking about the way that we act in society. The expectations. Everything is dramatic. Everything is a drama. Why do you think drama is so popular in the media? Everybody loves a good drama. I know I do. And so another one of the theorists or sociologists that we look at is Manning. And Phil Manning also talked about Goffman's theory of dramaturgy. And he said that Goffman's definition of performance is all the activity of a given participant on a given occasion, which serves to influence in any way any of the other participants. A few pages later, he says, I've been using the term performance to refer to all activity of an individual which occurs during a period marked by his continuous presence before a particular set of observers and which has some influence on the observers. In other words, what he's saying is that your performance will continue to be what it is as long as you're within a group. Once you leave that group, or once you are out of that situation, then your performance for that particular group ends. The curtains go down. And so you are constantly constantly acting and performing as long as there's an audience. And an audience means as long as there's someone that influences your life, you're going to act. A lot of times, let's look at this technology or this media that we're on now called YouTube. Now, I don't see anybody. I'm looking at a screen. I'm looking at a camera. There's an environment around me, but there's nobody here for me to perform with. But performance does not necessarily require a physical other to be there. You're there, number one, and then the situation is there. And so based on that situation, I'm performing. I'm performing on this camera because I know that eventually someone's going to look at this. It doesn't matter how many. It doesn't matter whether or not it goes viral or not. It's still an observational situation. I am the observer. And because I am the observer, I'm constantly aware that I'm being observed. And so I'm performing. I'm acting. This might sound something like quantum physics to a certain degree, but it is. It is to a certain degree, but not particularly, because quantum physics goes more into a more technical, more in-depth reality of the observer. But in sociology, we're all observers because we're all reading the situation that we're put in, and we're looking back in our pages of memory, and we're saying, what did I learn about how I'm supposed to perform and act in this situation? What did I learn? What can I pull from my experiences, from my environment, from situations I've been in, from those who have influenced my life, from the socializing agents such as schools, education, our peer groups, family, the media? What have I learned about how I'm supposed to act? And so we're always performing, always performing. Every situation that we're in, there's an observer to influence how we perform. This is the dramaturgical aspect of life. This is not, quote, a topic where you're going to actually be able to go back and say, whoa, wait a minute, I'm doing this, or you're going to put all this together in every situation that you're in. But it can enlighten you to some degree to be aware of how you're acting. Choose the best performance, choose the best mannerisms, not necessarily trying to be people pleasers, because in another topic, our next topic, we're going to talk about first impressions, which have a lot to do with social psychology. It's more the blending of psychology and sociology, where we're dealing with first impressions, how our first impressions are very much so regulated, but so are the first impressions of others. So don't think that you're in this alone, that you're the only one performing this great part. Every person that is born onto this planet is born to perform a certain way. And based on your environment, based on the situation, based on your concept of the situation, you're going to perform. That means when you go to work, you know that there are certain acceptable behaviors that you're supposed to be able to share. There are certain emotions that you have to regulate on your job. You can't go on your job screaming and hollering and having temper tantrums. You have to manage your behavior. Whereas if you're at home, you may feel more comfortable having a temper tantrum or going off or just expressing yourself in a way that is uncivilized, because you have read the situation and you say, I'm safe performing this particular part in this situation, but in this situation, there's a price that I may have to pay. And so from that perspective, we get into the acting part of our life. And so we know that life is a stage. When individuals are born, they have no concept of performance or how they are expected to act. So we look at our birth as the genesis of social cohesion. It happens right away. People have no say in how they will perform the roles they are expected to play, nor the social status they will be born into. Life presented itself to us as a stage, and each person was thrust onto it the day they were born, as we stated. When we talked about the doctor spanking the baby, expecting a sound, parents looking into their baby's eyes, expecting a smile, and babies learning how to manage themselves as they continue to become familiar with the situation. And the more they're able to understand what the situation is defining for them and how the situation is defining their performance. They learn how to control their behavior, which we talked about, making good impressions. They learn acceptable conversation and actions. They shy away from taboo subjects. You ever been in the situation where someone says, wow, this is not the perfect situation for discussing politics and religion, right? So we perform. We avoid those topics in certain situations. We learn to be respectful of others and how to perform on cue. So this becomes very, very relevant. And so we know that creating our entire lives, we're creating a self. We're creating the concept of a self, because we're never the same person in every situation. We may feel that we are because we're familiar with the self, but we are not necessarily the same person that we are in every situation that we're in. Once you create a concept of a self, we perform the parts. We feel are assigned to that self. As we grow, the self create and the parts they perform expand more, and we integrate into society. It's hard many times to conceptualize a necessary self. In other words, you may feel today the person that you are is necessary. But tomorrow you may not feel that the way you acted today is necessary, given the situation that you're in. And so there are examples in society to look at, and from there a sense is gathered of social expectations. Do you realize that? Stereotypes are used to help develop the self-concept. That's why you have people who are constantly trying to fight against the societal stereotypes that are being impressed on them, because they have become aware that, wait a minute, society is saying that I'm this way because I was born into this situation or because of the environment that I'm in. But I'm learning that I can have upward mobility, which means that I can mobilize myself outside of these stereotypes that have been set for me. So, it is understandable. In other words, the social personality is based on stereotypes. It's understandable for us to see people fighting stereotypes and saying, this is not who I am. This is unacceptable. You cannot define me by this situation. People tend to associate the self with the in-group and the out-group we discussed. So being born means automatic membership into the biggest group, as we stated earlier, called the social club or the human race. And so this is just a little topic on what it means to be born to perform. And one of the social theorists that we kind of took some of our concepts from is Ervin Goffman. And he is the social theorist that coined the phrase dramaturgy or dramaturgical. And so I have a book called Born to Perform that will be coming out very soon. And this topic is based on that book that I have written. And so we understand. And next week, like I said, we're going to be talking, the topic that we're going to discuss next week is going to be a topic called the social construction of reality. Well, before that, we're going to talk about first impressions. And because it's very important, if you're going to understand socialization, that you don't always just understand it from the influential part of it, what's influencing you to be the self that you are. But also you have to, that's from the outside looking in. Our next topic is going to be based on first impressions, you looking inside and projecting what you see inside of you for others to see, which also goes along with the concept of being born to perform. And so I would like to thank you for being with me for this short period of time. And hopefully this topic on socialization will help you have a better understanding of it. And as we stated in our first video, we are doing this topic on a very, very down-to-earth manner. We're not using a lot of concepts, perspectives, and theoretical terms and theories to necessarily bring our point across, but we're trying to talk to you from a layman's perspective. And from that perspective, we will continue to move through this series on socialization. And from this series, we will go into another part of our series on sociology, which we will talk about peer groups, or we will talk about agents of sociology. So that will be another segment of topics that we will talk about. But right now, we're trying to build a foundation on socialization, and this will probably end up being 4 or 5 topics in this series, and the next series will be on agents of socialization. And so when we talk about the agents of socialization, we will break down for you all of the agencies that influence who you are and who you are becoming, who you think you are, and who you, everything about who you are and your reality and how that is built. And from that perspective, we talk about the social construction of reality. And so I want to thank you once again for spending time with me, and I enjoyed this time with you, and we will see you in our next video. Thank you.